We served as national co-chairs of the presidential campaign that swept this nation. It started in 2016. He is a congressman, a champion of justice, education, and health care for all. Khanna is an activist, and I am so glad to have him on this episode of Hello Somebody. Congressman, welcome to Hello Somebody.
Thank you for having me on, Nina. You know, I'm a big fan and I'm honored.
So happy to have you. As everyone knows, you and I served most recently as co-chairs of a national presidential campaign that swept this nation starting in 2015 to lift up issues of justice for all people. And it was quite a ride for us in 2020, wouldn't you say?
It was an extraordinary ride, and I am so glad we got to do it together with Mayor Cruz and Ben Cohen. I am so proud of our efforts. I think every issue we talked about, that the senator talked about, health care for all, a living wage, making sure everyone has education, these are now obvious, I think, to so many Americans. Police violence reform, the senator was out in front because of people like you on that, and I'm glad that finally it seems that the issues we were fighting for are being embraced.
Yeah, I do too. And the whole movement itself, I mean, certainly there have been progressive leaders throughout history who have stood up for these issues, who've never relented. In many ways, they passed the baton to us in the 21st century to keep it going, just as we will pass the baton to the next group of freedom fighters, so to speak, to keep advancing the causes of social, political, economic, racial, environmental justice, the whole umbrella of justice. And speaking of police, Congressman, I'm glad you brought that up. I know that you introduced a bill most recently called the Peace Act. Talk to us about that and why you felt that it was pivotal to introduce such a bill.
First of all, I was just horrified, like everyone in this country, with the murder of George Floyd and the helplessness. And that's what struck me, that here was this black man just pleading for his life, politely, saying please over and over again, asking for mercy, and the utter cruelty of an officer who was engaged in violence beyond even killing. I mean, just gratuitous cruelty. But we had introduced this, Lacy, Clay, and I, this Peace Act almost a year ago. And the basic thrust is that 46 other countries, Western democracies, under the European Convention for Human Rights, have a standard which says force should be a last resort. In other words, you don't use force unless it's the absolutely last thing to do. In our country, believe it or not, we're still under the Supreme Court standard from 1989 by William Rehnquist that says you can use force if it's reasonable. One of the reasons cops aren't prosecuted, one of the reasons cops get away with using this violence is that juries often defer to their judgment of what is reasonable. And we need to move away from this reasonableness standard, making it clear that you cannot use force unless it's absolutely necessary and a last resort. This not only would save black lives, brown lives, in terms of victims, I actually think it would save police officer lives by forcing de-escalation as opposed to relying on the judgment of officers.
Agreed. And when communities feel safe and when they feel that they can trust law enforcement, it not only helps the community, it does help those officers themselves, and it is vitally important. You know, I participated in, well, led actually a effort here in Ohio. I know that you have talked in interviewing about the Peace Act. You talked about the shooting of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, which did happen in my home city. 12 years old, 2 seconds from the police officers hitting the scene or getting out of the vehicle, so to speak. One of the officers opened fire on Tamir Rice, who was in a playground playing with a toy gun. The 911 call was very clear in that the person who made the call, who sounded white, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was, but he sounded white, thought that Tamir Rice had a real gun, but he was clear. He told the dispatcher, I'm not sure. And whether or not it was the case, the way the officers came on the scene did not lend any, if people, and I encourage people to go back and watch the video, did not lend any opportunities for the police officers to really assess the scene, because they came up so hot, literally. And the shooter, before he even got out of the car all the way, was already shooting at this 12-year-old boy. When he was interviewed, he said he thought that Tamir Rice was 20 years old. As you and I know, Congressman, that African-American children are often said to look older than what they really are. And for me, that is just another way to strip Black children from their childhood and also their humanity, that somehow Tamir Rice was not a little boy, but rather a 20-year-old young man. And even if he was a 20-year-old young man, how they handled that situation is totally unacceptable. And so I had 2 months left on my Senate term, and I thought I was aching inside. It was right before Thanksgiving, and I ended up calling Governor John Kasich and said to the Governor, we have some power here. Even in 2 months, I didn't let the fact that I would no longer be actively elected stop me from using the power that I did have and the influence to act right away. And I will say that Governor Kasich did not hesitate, brought us down. I went down there with some of my colleagues, got a chance to talk to him about how we have a moral obligation, and also he has the legal authority of executive order to do something to prevent my city and this state from burning. And he did just that, Congressman. And we had, for the first time, the Ohio Task Force on Community Police Relations. That is just one example of what can happen when people act expeditiously and don't wait for protest or wait for people to demonstrate to get you to do the right thing and to hear their pain. And we ended up traveling all over the great state of Ohio, opening up venues for citizens from all walks of life to say whatever they had to say, whatever was on their mind, however they were feeling about a system that is totally unjust. Let the record reflect that we know that it is unjust in many ways. For poverty, if you're poor, certainly if you are Black and brown, indigenous, it's just an unfair system. And Congress, that really helped our city and this state not to explode.
I admire so much your leadership and your willingness in that case to cross the aisle and work with John Kasich, a Republican. And I highly recommend people read the op-ed that you wrote with him, because it shows that this is an issue that frankly should transcend party. It's an issue about justice. I mean, Tamir Rice is a case where those officers did not need to start by shooting. There are a lot of other things they could have done to de-escalate the situation, to make sure that people were safe without taking the life of an innocent boy, a 12-year-old boy. And as a father, of course, it just completely breaks your heart to see that kind of loss of life. And the challenge in this reasonable standard is an officer can say, well, I thought it was reasonable, I felt fearful, and these juries too often defer to them. And that's why we've got to make it clear that no, it's not about an officer's judgment. We can't trust an officer's judgment in that situation. Too many times people have died because of inappropriate judgments. We have to make it clear that it's a last resort. But one of the things I'm glad in this country that's happening is we're finally talking about the reality, which is this is not about people of color. This is about Black Americans and their experience. My heart skipped the beat. I've got a young son, and
yes.
2.5, and he always, when we go for a walk and you see police cars, he's fascinated by police cars, and he says, police car. And I was thinking, what if you're a Black boy growing up? I mean, it's a totally different experience in this country, and I'm glad we're finally talking about the discrimination and violence that Black men and women face, and that I saw a poll that finally Black Lives Matter is enjoying almost majority support in this country. So I do think something has fundamentally changed after this incident.
I think so, Congressman. We got to continue to push to make it so, and I'm so glad that you introduced the Peace Act, because those who do hold titles in this moment, actively elected, have an obligation to act, in the same way that Governor Kasich and I did. There are countless leaders all across this country, from the local, regional, state, and federal levels of government, who can bond their powers. There's a synergy that should happen right now in this moment. We're never going to get this moment back quite again. Mr. Floyd will never get his life back again, and the countless George Floyds or Georgina Floyds before him. And hopefully we can reduce the likelihood that there will be any after him. And I'm saying those words, as you know, my husband is a retired police officer, and our son is currently in law enforcement. So I carry a heaviness on both sides, understanding that the system was built, and we don't want to admit it, that as one of the people I had an opportunity to talk to today laid out, that yes, Trump is uniquely bad on race. He's a unique threat. But all of these variables, from poverty to racism to white supremacy to a paternalistic society that robs people of their full potential based on their gender and their class, all of those things were in place before this man took office. And we have to call that what it is, at the same time fighting against this 21st century version of fascism that is coming from this president. And I applaud you, Congressman, for being that bright light that is out there and actively engaged. And you say and you do things that may not be politically correct, but they are morally correct. And I think you draw upon, and I would love to hear you talk to us about your grandfather and what motivates you, what drives you, because you could easily just turn a blind eye to these matters, but you do not. You are actually out in the trenches, both using your elected office, but as somebody that lives in this world, you care about these issues deeply. So talk to us about your grandfather.
I appreciate that. He's been my inspiration. He spent 4 years in jail during Gandhi's movement. My grandmother tells the story of in the 1940s when he was taken to jail. My grandmother was raising her kids, and they didn't know whether my grandfather was alive or not. And her oldest son every year would go to the jail with some clothes and some sweets, and the guards would never let him see my grandfather. And so for 4 years they didn't know my grandfather's condition, but he made it out of jail, and of course India went on to see independence. I don't think he would have ever dreamed that his grandson would be in the United States Congress, but his commitment for 15 years, which was his involvement in the independence struggle, gave me a sense that people who fight for justice can prevail, and that ultimately human dignity and human rights are the most important things, and that our generation, my generation's challenge is how do we build a post-colonial world where we recognize the dignity of everyone. And of course, in the American context, Dr. King and others were so inspired by Gandhi's teaching. It was one of Dr. King carried a Bible, and our Gandhi reader, and James Lawson, who we honored recently in Congress and lives in Los Angeles, had gone to India and was one of the people who studied Gandhi. And in the American context, we have to understand that the Native American community and the African American community, that these have been the two communities that have faced the brunt of racism, of institutional racism, of discrimination. The philosopher Charles Taylor says that given the institution of slavery in this country for hundreds of years, ingrained in the American psyche was a sense of blacks as less than, and that overcoming of that psychologically is so difficult. And it becomes even more difficult if we don't acknowledge it, if we pretend that these problems have gone away, not realizing that it was just 50 years ago that Dr. King was talking about riots and the need to have underlying injustices addressed. So my view is that all of us have to do our small part to fight for the dignity and rights of everyone, and that's what motivates my public service.
Oh, amen to that. I know your grandfather, your grandparents would be so proud of you and how you truly do wield the people's power on their behalf. I'm just proud to call you friend, and you are so right that the foundational, the original sin, if you will, of this nation, besides, we know they took the land from our indigenous sisters and brothers, and then it was dealing in chattel slavery. And those things happened separately and also simultaneously at the founding of this country. And the zeitgeist, if you will, of this nation has been and continues to be the othering of black people, the lack of love and respect for black thought, black bodies. And I contend that as the Black Lives Matter movement pretty much brought into focus why that slogan matters, that it really is about Black Lives Matter too, TOO. And it has been something that this country has not accepted in a universal way, meaning we don't see that teaming from all aspects of life. And that when Black Lives Matter, everybody's life will matter, because when you look at the hierarchy in terms of how people navigate society up or down, there is evidence, clear evidence, both anecdotal and empirical, that white people tend to occupy, if we were to visualize a triangle, white people as a group, just generally speaking, I know we have sisters and brothers from all walks of life who are poor and who are suffering. I get that, and you and I are champions for those people. In terms of the racialized nature of our society, the ethnocentric or the Eurocentric worldview that permeates everything that we do, is in our subconscious. We don't even have to think. And so when you look at that triangle, whites are at the very top, blacks are at the bottom, and then every other group kind of navigates in that middle somewhere, depending on what time period we are in. But think about that, the permanence of whites being at the very top and blacks being at the very bottom. Something is wrong with that. And so when you do take care of the least of these, the groups that suffer the most, the groups that bear the brunt of an anti-black and racist, and I say those two things very deliberately, when we take care of that original sin, we will go a long way to fixing the problem before we can get to healing. I know a lot of people are calling for healing. Myself, I believe that we do need a moment of healing, but we can't heal without fixing the situation. And so it's vitally important. So Congressman, it leads me to, you led this past February, you led a career fair specifically for the African American community. What made you do that? And were you worried about other people saying, what about us?
No, but when you pointed out, and so eloquently, Nina, and Senator Turner, in a way that only you can, given both your lived experience in public service and all your dedication to these issues, the role of institutional racism against African Americans, against the black community, and how we have to recognize that and tackle that. And I guess from my view, the Black Lives Matter, I mean, when ordinary people think of it, they think of police violence, but in my view, it's so much broader than that, right? I mean, Black Lives Matter, and that means we ought to be investing in their human potential. We ought to be giving them opportunities to jobs and networks and the internet. I was talking to Valerie Jarrett briefly, and she said one of the things that drives her crazy is suddenly with COVID-19, everyone has realized that a lot of black and brown kids don't have access to the internet. They haven't had access to the internet for the past 15 years. Why did it take a crisis to open people's eyes to it?
That's right.
And the sense is that there is extraordinary talent among African Americans. They tend to score, more in computer science in terms of pursuing it, and in terms of their interest in it at San Jose State and at the HBCUs, but they're denied the opportunity because they don't have the same networks to have these jobs. I mean, the networking gap is huge, and so I wanted to be intentional, given there's an intentional exclusion of African Americans in Silicon Valley, and say we need to target the African American community. We need to own up to fact that they have been excluded from the technology revolution so far. I mean, consider this, Senator, the racial wealth gap in this country has increased since 1980. That means that,
Yes.
that the wealth that's generated in the technology revolution is increasing so far, the wealth gap. And the Industrial Revolution was exclusionary. We all know that. We all know that the black community didn't get to benefit from a lot of the programs of the New Deal. We know that many of the manufacturing jobs, they weren't able to unionize. They were in the lowest part of those jobs in terms of wages. And so the question I believe is so are we going to make the same mistake and have the technology revolution be exclusionary? I mean, shame on us if we don't figure out how to get the talent of the African American community and other minority communities to be part of the new economy. And so we were intentional about creating the jobs fair in San Jose State. I've been intentional about working with HBCUs, the one in Jim Clyburn when we visited his district with Claflin and South Carolina State University and with Howard University. And we've just got to scale this and start with the premise that there's a tremendous amount of talent out there. The problem is the lack of investment. One, I know I've gone long, but one other point, which I think it's really important to realize, 43% of Americans have some post-high school credential. That number falls to 30% when you look at the black community. And the Lumina Foundation has said it needs to be around 60% for a society in a knowledge economy where you need some credential post-high school.
Yes.
That ought to be when Black Lives Matter. We need to be talking about that systematic underinvestment in black lives. It's not just about the violence. It's about systematic change to give people a real shot at the American dream.
Agreed. Intentionality matters so much. What is our buzzword for today? Intentionality. And so glad that you intentionally had that job fair and that you continue to do what you do on behalf of people who are really suffering in this country through no fault of their own. It's really hard for us as an American people, generally speaking, to admit the experiment. You know, Dr. West has said many times that it is a failed experiment, and he is right. It's hard. Just say ouch. But it is hard. It is true. But it doesn't, just because it is the reality today, does not mean it has to be the reality tomorrow if we all will do what we can where we are with what we have to be, in the words of Brother Mahatma Gandhi, the change that we want to see in the world. Congressman, if someone were to ask you, Congressman, what can I do? I'm not elected to Congress. I don't hold any elected office. How can I be the change I want to see in the world? I feel so helpless. What can I do to make a difference? What would you say to them?
I'd say your ability to make change is in some ways more than mine. I mean, when you're in Congress, when you're in an institution, you have so many institutional considerations and obligations, but I never read the history of this country thinking that the change has come from the United States Congress or from the Supreme Court or even from the president. Usually they're lagging indicators. The change comes from grassroots activism, from civic leadership. Look at the impact that the Black Lives Matter movement has had. They started out as a movement which even Democrats were afraid to, some Democrats were afraid to embrace. And now the whole country understands why they were fighting what they were fighting for. And I do think we're going to get some police reform legislation actually passing the House in the next couple of weeks. So I understand the anger, the slowness of the political process, the sense of frustration. But what people here should know is that when you show up at a protest, when you engage in activism, when you engage in mobilization online, all of those things are making the difference to have us have a more just society. And without that, we have no chance. Without that, you're going to just have the status quo. So being a citizen, an active citizen, is still the biggest way to bring change in this country.
Amen. And so we know that we will get some type of police reform. Congressman, but how do we reform our country? Police officers are really just a microcosm in law enforcement. And I say that because there are other titles within the law enforcement agencies, but they are just a microcosm of who we are really as a country. They are the first line in terms of entree into the system itself. However, we don't talk about why it is that police officers or law enforcement officers respond in the way that they do. Besides the training is just ingrained in them not to see certain communities as protecting and serving those communities. Rather, as some experts say, many in law enforcement are trained to occupy those communities, particularly black communities and then poor communities as a whole. And so while I am excited that we will get some reforms percolating across this country, what can we do to reform ourselves as a nation?
Well, that's such a deep question. I mean, and that is the question. I mean, it was sad to me when I was rereading, and sometimes I do Dr. King's speeches about rioting, and he was obviously very opposed to rioting, and he said that condemning riots isn't going to do anything because riots will keep happening until we deal with the fundamental injustices of the society. And it's a speech worth reading by anyone who cares about human dignity and our democracy. But to see 50 years later the same situation erupting in this country, it just gives you a sense of the injustices that still exist. I guess the first thing we need to do to start to find some common way forward is to recognize the problem, to not talk about things as, well, we're in a post-racial America, though that may have been the dream of electing President Obama. What we can say is it was a constructive step, but you can't talk about things as post-racial. We can't talk about euphemisms as people of color. I mean, we got to be real. The experience of growing up Indian American in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, while it had certain challenges, was very different than growing up black in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And so we've got to speak, I think, precisely and truthfully and acknowledge this stain, this moral stain in our history, and acknowledge that there's still so much work remaining to be done. I think if we start with that, just a candid acknowledgement of the problem, where you can have a more honest dialogue, and then you say, well, what hope is there? I saw white women in places like Wadsworth, Ohio, and Medina, Ohio, and those are pretty white Republican areas out there protesting. And so that says, okay, maybe there's some change. Maybe it's not just the folks near my district in Oakland and San Jose protesting. If we got people in Medina and Wadsworth protesting, maybe there's some change. But change is not going to come in terms of accommodation to injustice. Change is going to come when people realize the injustice and are working collectively to solve those injustices.
As they say in the black church, Representative, that preaches. Congressman, even in the midst of just the enormous pain that people are feeling all over this country, hopefully the spark that has been lit will not go away this time, and we won't be having the same sort of conversation, marches, pleading with people to understand, or at least try to understand, what black people are enduring and have endured for generations. This certainly is not new for the black community. We've been trying to tell people that this has been going on for a very long time. And so it just reminds me of someone that we had the opportunity to get to know a little better in terms of what it really means to keep hope alive. And that is Reverend Jesse Jackson. And it's just something fundamentally powerful about that phrase, keep hope alive, that no matter what we're enduring, keep hope alive, no matter what things look like, keep hope alive, keep pushing, keep mobilizing, keep fighting. What does that mean to you, and how can we utilize that clarion call, if you will, for this particular moment that we are in?
For Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jackson is a hero of mine. I mean, I grew up memorizing his speeches in the 84 and 88 convention. It was such an honor to have spoken with him for hours, as both you and I did, and helped get him to endorse Senator Sanders. And they both share so much in common in terms of their commitment to a just foreign policy, a just economic policy, justice on race issues and social issues. And, you know, you look at his life and you look at his struggles and his awareness of the struggles of people like Representative Lewis and Representative Clyburn and Dr. King and Dr. Cornel West, and you think, you know, what keeps them going? I mean, it would be easy to give in to despair, to give in to a sense of nihilism, a sense that the situation in this country is so bad and doesn't seem to get better or get better fast enough, and that is something that would be understandable if someone had that sentiment. But they managed to overcome that. They managed to, in their own example, show that they had that hope, that inner strength to continue to hope, to continue to strive for something better. And isn't that, in some sense, the Black experience in America? It's one of the reasons so much of our art, so much of our literature, so much of our music comes from the Black community, because I think we appreciate the resilience, the sense of faith and belief and hope in spite of grave injustice, and it's a testament to the human spirit. And so for Jesse Jackson to stand up in the 1980s and the Reagan years and say, no, I'm as a Black man going to run for president,
that I can, and announce to you this day my decision to seek the nomination of the Democratic Party for the presidency of the United States.
And come so close in taking on his own party, and come so close. I think that opened the door for Barack Obama, certainly, but it opened the door for any person of color to dream to be able to serve. And, you know, we're not going to know the true impact people like him have had for another 50 years. But I think 50 years, hopefully it doesn't take that long, but whenever we do get to that final place of a better democracy, a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, we will look to people like him, people like Senator Sanders, these people who were crusaders, people like you, Senator
people like
Khanna,
you.
and now for fighting for a more just society, and for having the hope. I mean, my life has been much more privileged, certainly, than my grandfather or people like Reverend Jackson. But those who faced those odds and still fought and still believed, I think that's what gives young people some sense of hope. I mean, I think they and you and others have to share your story so people know that the hope is not unearned. It's not a hope of blindness. It's a hope based on experience, a hope despite the struggles. And I think that type of real talk is what may reach young people to continue to fight.
There it is. We fight on. We're going to keep the faith and keep the fight. Thank you so much, Congressman. It was such a pleasure to have you on Hello Somebody, and we look forward to having you join us again.
I appreciate it.
Hello Somebody is a production of Large Media Network. Our logo and web design was created by Grace & Co. Special thanks to other members of the Hello Somebody team: Tiffany Hale, Pepper Chambers, the hot one, Julia Griffin, Angelo Greco, and Anna Mesa. Now, if you would like to support our production, please become a member on patreon.com/Hello Somebody. And finally, come join us for more conversation on my social media channels @Nina Turner.